understanding and wisdom are kind of moving in the same direction here. I think that's probably what wisdom is referring to here. And I think, yeah, I mean, you put it very nicely in terms of that framework, that we need to arrive at beyond the data, which is just the stuff that we measure, as it were, and we gather, as what people have said, it's the measurements that we've gathered. We've got all of that, but we need to turn it into information in terms of our results. And then we need to do something more with that. We need to analyze it. We need to argue for significance around that. And then we need to contextualize it and make it valuable in some way. Absolutely. It was quite interesting in my little attempt to try and find out who said this. I went up all kinds of interesting little alleys, and I found a blog post written by somebody in the field of knowledge management. And he referred to somebody who put all of this into a sort of a triangle, a pyramid with wisdom at the top. And what I thought was quite interesting was that he used, now see, I would like this being an applied linguist. There were certain words that he said that were associated. I don't know if I can read this now. So, for example, if you think of the bottom of the pyramid, the data, which are discrete elements, he indicated the words that you would associate with that as being categorize, calculate, quantify, collect. Okay, so to do with the data. Then with information, the words that he associated with that were contextualize, compare, connect, prioritize, frame. I think those words are very insightful into seeing the difference between them. Then knowledge, the words that he sort of showed as being belonging to this particular layer, is structure, interpret, evaluate, deconstruct. And then wisdom is the application of knowledge, embody, synthesize, weave. So I thought that was actually quite an interesting lot of insight into those different levels. So throughout these final chapters, and this is why I'm putting them all together, we need to see it as a whole, really, as a sort of a development from the data that you've collected through a series of arguments, your broad findings, your close findings, and your evaluation is what you're achieving in these final chapters. So you can see they're absolutely crucial to the enterprise, and certainly not to be shuffled off quickly in the last month. Takes time, it takes thought, and it's really worth doing well. Now, Evans and Gruber suggest that what do you do when you're faced with so much data? I don't know if you feel in that position sometimes. You've got so much stuff. What do you do with it? And they give some sort of guidelines. First of all, make sure you record and file your data systematically. You need to be systematic about it. And then you can pull out what it is that's important that you need to highlight. You can create your tables, you can create your figures, etc. One really useful piece of practical information that they give is include enough data in your appendix so that the reader can see how you collected it, what it looks like, and how you treated it when you condensed it. So you're always not going to include all your data, but it's useful to have an appendix where you give the reader, the examiner, some idea of how you worked with your data. doing that for my doctoral thesis, with my supervisor saying to me, "You've done all these analyses of all these documents. It seems such a pity that nobody's going to see." So we chose one, and I sort of motivated for it to be typical, and then I included it in my appendix so that the reader could see that what I was talking about was based on this kind of analysis. I actually provided an analysis of one of the documents. So I think that's quite useful and practical advice. Then in your chapter, you need to present your results so that it's clear how they link with your questions, they relate with your questions. Because you're going to find a whole lot of stuff that isn't necessarily absolutely necessary in order to answer your questions. So what you choose to put into your results chapter should actually have a clear relationship. Remember, we've said this all the way along, that your research questions are the engine of your dissertation. Again, they're still providing the chugging power through this. You need to have your questions in mind when you're writing your results as well. And that will help you to know how to select and to organize. Okay, then discussion and evaluation is sort of moving towards the knowledge, wisdom side of things. Your discussion is needed so that you can actually come to some conclusions from your study. And again, Evans and Gruber, I've got the reference, I'll show you at the end. It's a very nice little book. I like it because it takes the angle that I think is so important about purpose and the reader as being crucial to keep in mind throughout all your writing. They say that writing a discussion we find problematic because we need a framework, but we don't really know what the conclusions are yet. It's a bit open. We haven't quite, if we've got a genuine study, we don't actually know necessarily how we're going to pull all the conclusions together. But we do need a framework in order to structure what we say. And they, again, have some nice practical processes that one can use. And they say that when you're writing your discussion, the first thing to do is to brainstorm everything that you know now that you didn't know before you started the study. So I'm going to suggest that on a piece of paper for 2 minutes, we just do this as a free writing exercise. So you need a sheet of paper, or half a sheet of paper, or the back of a sheet of paper. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes just to write. You're not writing for anybody. This is personal writing now. This is writing for yourself. But to start the process of thinking about what do you know, what conclusions are you already coming to? Because the authors say that actually you have been drawing conclusions somewhere deep inside of you all the time. You can't help but be thinking the way your study is taking you. So they suggest that you brainstorm. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes, starting now. Don't stop writing. Just don't think too much. The point of this is to engage with what you know, just what you know. What is it that you know now about your topic that you didn't know before? Don't think, just start writing. So I now know that, and keep going. The point is not to think, because you're trying now to impose a framework. The idea is to try and get in touch with the sort of inchoate, I suppose, understandings that you've developed through your study. And you're not going to read it to anybody, you're not going to share it with anybody, so you don't worry about grammar, don't worry about full sentences, just write. stop you now, but it's a pity really, because there was a sort of flow of things happening. And this sort of free writing is something that you can use for all kinds of purposes at many stages in your dissertation. Sometimes when you get stuck, it's helpful just to do free writing. Just give yourself 10 minutes and just write down everything that you're thinking with regard to this issue or regard to this chapter or whatever. Sometimes we think that we can't do research unless we've got our computer and we've got the photocopies of the journal articles, but there's a whole lot of processing and thinking that is going on in our heads, and it's sometimes really helpful to just try and put it down and see what comes out. So this is probably difficult for some of you who are still at the research proposal stage. I remember from our discussion last week. But to do a free writing at that stage is helpful in a different way. But what Evans and Gruber are saying, that what you need to do is to dialogue between your creative mind, which is what's been flowing now, and creating some sort of framework for your chapter. Because that's the problem, is we don't know what the framework is. We're not quite sure what all our conclusions are yet. We've got to develop them in the chapter, but how do we do this? And he says we've already got good ideas in our creative minds about what we've been learning. So having done a sort of a brainstorm, what he suggests that you would do when you're planning your discussion chapter is to look at what you've written and then to try and sort it and categorize it into a framework. So you look at what you've written, you put circles around things, you say, well, this is pretty much the same thing, here's a different point, and you come up with 3 or 4 sort of conclusions. And these should respond to the aim of so you need to link it, think about what the aim, the research problem was, what your research objectives were, and these conclusions should link with that. If you have other conclusions, they suggest that maybe this is something that you ought to bring into earlier chapters. But by this stage, you should have 3 or 4 conclusions which link with your research objectives. So this is something that you can try. Then the next stage would be to create headings from those categories, and then underneath that, subheadings, etc., subsection headings. They need to be logical. And then you've got a preliminary framework, which will start you off on writing. And you will add to this and, make it more sophisticated, cover more things, whatever it is, go in more depth. But this is a way to give yourself a preliminary framework for your discussion chapter. So there's something that you could try when you're writing your discussion chapter. Then another thing that they suggest to do is in order to make sure that your discussion really links with the rest of the thesis and really links with your research aims and your questions, is to do what they call a mini thesis logic check, which requires you to write out, no, we don't do that anymore, to cut and paste introductions and conclusions into one mini document. So introduction to chapter 1, conclusion to chapter 1, introduction to chapter 2, put it into one document and read the whole thing through and see whether it's logical. Because if your chapters are logically related to each other and comes to a logical sort of conclusion, so should your mini thesis check. So there's 2 practical strategies that you could try out. Right, I think I'll look at what goes into a conclusion, and then we'll have a look at how we offer time. So
10 to 3.
All right, so now we've looked at, in broad brush strokes, the results and the discussion and sort of what the difference is between them. Let's just have a look at the conclusion chapter, which is really what the dissertation has been arguing for. Your conclusion chapter, you draw from the discussion chapter, you pull it all together in the conclusions. Sometimes what happens when we write conclusions is we get new ideas and we get excited and put those into our conclusions as well. If you get new ideas, go and find another home for them earlier on. But your conclusion should not be introducing any new ideas. Sometimes your conclusions are integrated into your discussion chapter, but then you need to say discussion and conclusions if you do that. And again, the conclusions respond to the purpose and aims in the first chapter. There we go again. You know, all the way through, we've got those research questions that are the heartbeat of the whole dissertation. So basically, what your conclusion does is it looks back at what I have done in the dissertation, and it looks at why what I have done matters. So you need to leave this whole thing on a very strong note, having made sure that your reader is left in no doubt as to the fact that you have added value to the field. You've made some kind of contribution. So the conclusion isn't just a summary of everything. It does refer back to what you've done, but it focuses very much on why it matters, why it's significant. We've got two handouts each. If you don't have one in your hand, just look, share with somebody. If you're missing out on something, you can. Have we sent around the attendance register? Yeah. Okay, somewhere the attendance register is going on. If you didn't get a handout, just write down their handout and I will email it. Okay, so if you just look at the typical elements in the final chapters of the dissertation, I'm going to say the same thing that I always say when it comes to moves. They are really functional, purposeful things. All right, this is not a formula, it's not a recipe. These are the sorts of things that need to happen in your chapter. And you'll see that when it got to the discussion, there's been quite a bit of research, but it's very disciplinary based, and even within any discipline, there's so many different ways to do a discussion that applied linguists are a bit bamboozled trying to kind of even put it into some sort of idea of moves. Swales had the idea that there's sort of points that need to be included. So I tried to show that diagrammatically by making you that little sort of patchwork quilt affair. These are the kinds of things that you would be dealing with in a discussion. Okay, I don't know if it's very helpful, but anyway. So in the results chapter, generally in the literature that's analyzed the structures and the way that these sorts of chapters are built up, they suggest that you would get four major sort of purposes in this chapter. In the first one is you sort of consolidate the research space by sort of previewing the chapter, doing the things that an introduction really does. This is basically the introduction to your results chapter. Linking, giving a bit of background, referring to methodology, stating the purpose, etc. Okay. And then you would also mention about how you're going to organize your tables, figures, graphs, whether you've got things in the appendix or not. This would all be sort of part of consolidating the research space.